Today on Public Research.
Aleph Bet Yehoshua, the great Israeli novelist and theorist, said once that basically diaspora is a form of neurosis. It's very difficult to reconcile being a Jew within the context of another nation, and Israel resolves that for you. I mean, it's the one place in the world where you stop thinking about being Jewish.
After decades at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, journalist Ron Kampeas has met more of the crucial power players in Israeli and Jewish American affairs than almost anyone. After his retirement from JTA, Kampeas returns to the show to share his expert view on the past and future of Israel a year after we spoke following the October 7th attacks. I get his view on the prospect of West Bank annexation, delusions of the Israeli far right, Iran, and the future of Gaza. I was in a remarkable Twitter space this morning. Usually the pro-Israel Twitter spaces are just like aggressive, sort of jingoistic, not that interesting. And people saying ridiculous stuff. We should get rid of all of them should go, that. But I went into it and they were actually talking about something really interesting. There's this new strategy that people are getting behind, which would be Israel just completely disengaging with Gaza after the hostage deal, like a total disengagement, much more severe than 2005.
Uh-huh.
No guest workers, no relationship, but Israel would leave the Rafah crossing and basically just sort of let the Gazans do whatever they want. Not our problem anymore. Go do whatever you want to do, and if you attack us, we're going to treat you like another country.
Right.
And I was listening to it and I was like, I kind of prefer this option to the renewing settlements in Gaza. Or even the stuff of like, we're going to do a 40-year project of reforming the schools,
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand where it's coming from. I think that, even before October the 7th, even before 2005, Gaza was a headache. Amir Tibon, who's endured 9 hours, the Haaretz journalist who endured 9 hours in his safe room with his wife and 2 small daughters while his father traveled down to Gaza to help rescue him, titled his book "The Gates of Gaza" because, and he used it from a speech in 1956, I think, by Moshe Dayan. The phrase came from that, and the reference was to the Hebrew version for hell, Azazel, which sounds like a longer version of Aza, which is how they say Gaza. So it's like the gates of hell. It's always been an irritant. I just don't know how practical it is. I mean, so they whoever is coming up with this, as you described it, they account for the prospect that it could bubble up again by saying, if you act against us, we're ready to engage with war, but otherwise we're cutting you off completely. But it doesn't. But that's not how it has worked. I mean, October the 7th was all-out war because it was carried out by the sovereign or the preeminent actor in Gaza, the Hamas. But previously, there have been these tensions because Islamic Jihad or even another organization is making provocations while Hamas is trying to control them. And they're, the whole 1950s was characterized by Fedayeen acting without the backing of the Nasser government in Egypt, crossing the border and committing acts of terrorism. So there's always going to be something there, and it's not necessarily something that can be divided into a binary of we're just going to cut you off or it's going to be all-out war. There has to be a longer-term accommodation, I think, and I don't know how you get there, but I don't know if this is going to work. But I mean, I think you're right in the sense that it's a healthier view. It's sort of like it shows like there's even though I don't know if it's realistic. It's like it's not anticipating settlement, which would involve ethnic cleansing, I think, and just the kind of involvement that really made life miserable for Gazans and for Israelis for a long time. And, the whole 40-year project, I'm the first one to say that I think that certainly in Gaza under Hamas, education needs to be reformed. I don't know. I just don't think that Israel's the actor that's going to, should do that, because I don't think it's going to work if it's if your enemy coming in and telling you how to think, that doesn't sound like it's going to end well.
There's just some kind of logic to me. The worst punishment for Hamas really is making them handle the sewage system. Is seriously, like making them govern this disaster.
I mean, that's the idea for since 2007 or 2006.
Yeah.
That Hamas should govern and find out what it's like to govern. The problem is that left unto their own devices, they don't govern. I mean, there was talk during during the recent war of I forget which international actors telling Hamas, the age-old question: why were you building tunnels? If you had the capacity to build tunnels and to build an infrastructure that could invade Israel and cause as much damage as it did, why aren't you doing that, using that energy and that money and those resources towards governing your people? And they said, that's not our problem. That's UNRWA. UNRWA does that. They don't even, they what we are seeing from the outside as the natural role of any kind of governing facility. And Hamas considers itself the government. They don't see it. They don't see themselves as that. They're not a government. They're a revolutionary organization. They seem to not be able to conceive of governing. So who's going to make them govern? It would be great, like, to actually have like a democracy in which they're accountable in their elections every 4 years, and they're thrown out if they don't govern. That would be interesting. But I don't know, how you get to there. I don't know. I mean, maybe there is some kind of way of setting that up and making them accountable, and then they could win elections and then be forced to be accountable to voters to make life easier for them rather than involve them in terrible wars. The paradox of Hamas is that it remains popular in the West Bank because it's among Palestinians, that is, because it's seen as a resistance movement, but it's hugely unpopular in Gaza because the Gaza Palestinians know exactly what their type of governance means for day-to-day life. It's disastrous. It's catastrophic.
Yeah, I'm sorry to begin on this weird. I gotta look at the Israeli guy that wrote the article and see how, because I haven't heard anybody proposing this idea before, but I am very intrigued by it. Yeah, there's a lot of logistical problems because apparently the idea would involve like no electricity. So I would be against that. I would want them to set up something where Egypt will provide that. I wouldn't want to see any kind of...
Like there'd have to be a transition, in other words, that
yeah.
Israel wouldn't fully depart until Egypt had set up its the means of providing infrastructure to the Palestinians.
That's my version. The Israelis' version was a little less humanitarian, but it is intriguing. What I've been saying to Israelis is the next, I want Israel to succeed, and I thought about what would a successful next PM, how would I measure it? And the way I would measure it is if a anti-Israel sort of zealot protester in 7 years is talking to their friend, and Netanyahu's gone, there's a new PM, and they lament, the movement's really died off because everybody's so convinced that this guy's so different just because he gives a few speeches. But they haven't done anything. He's no different from Netanyahu.
Right.
That would be a mark of a successful...
yeah. Well, we even saw it for like a year and a half when Lapid and Bennett were in charge. There was that reaction from the anti-Israel contingent.
Yeah, what I want Israel to do is to throw the anti-Israel movement curveballs, get them off balance. Because if Israel just keeps moving in the same Netanyahu right-wing direction. They know how to play that. They have the talking points. It's growing. It's going to keep growing because there are outrages in the West Bank. But I was thinking, if they did do this radical disengagement from Gaza, whoever did it could literally give a speech of, hey, we just ended the occupation. Do whatever you want.
Right.
Have fun.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that would be like, in other words, the thing is with that is you'd have to have Egyptian buy-in. I mean, that's kind of like how Israelis looking backwards conceive of 2005, like, oh, we left, and it was all good. But the problem is that they left, but they didn't leave any kind of infrastructure. I mean, there's like this one thing. Glenn Kessler, who's a reporter for the Washington Post, wrote a biography of Condoleezza Rice, and there was just this one fascinating tidbit in there that I've never seen anyone. I completely believe it. It's just when I say I've never seen anyone else, I think it's so significant, but only Glenn has paid attention to it. And that is that Ariel Sharon, on the eve of departure in 2005, told Condi Rice, I think maybe we will pull out the settlements, but not going to pull out the army because we're going to see the utter collapse of Gaza if we do that. And that would have that would have been interesting because Israel would have transitioned for the first time into actually occupying territory rather than colonizing it. And, for the first time, at least since 1968, when the first settlers got into the West Bank. And Condi Rice said, no, the plan is that the Palestinians are going to be autonomous. You have to get out completely and let them run things for themselves. And so that's how Israelis conceive of what happened in 2005, and what happened and then in 2007, they placed embargoes. They had Egyptian buy-in for the embargoes. There is something to the Palestinian claim that Israel, to a degree, continually occupied Gaza because of the controls that it exerted over the territory in that period. Even though, had Israel completely withdrawn, I think it's clear that Hamas still wouldn't have transitioned to a responsible government. But I think that for that to happen, like you said, I think you need a proper transition. You need some kind of controlling authority to say, okay, Israel's going to be completely disengaged from Gaza, and it's going to be and from the Israeli perspective, we're going to be able to say, like you say, to the world, look, we've completely left Gaza. That problem's up to the Gazans themselves and to the Egyptian, but you need something there for that to be credible. Because Portugal still bears responsibility for the chaos that's left in Angola, because that was like an overnight departure. Unlike other decolonization things, Portugal in 1975, I think, was in crisis. And with the exception of Macau, I think, just completely divested itself of its colonies, rather than having done what Britain and France did in Africa and other places, which was to slowly withdraw and to make sure that there was infrastructure and to make sure that there were governments ready to take over. And it was catastrophic. And I think that people would still today blame Portugal for how it pulled out of those things. And so you have had the same thing to a degree with Israel and Gaza.
Do you ever think, because I think about this all the time, that there was a mistake in either 48 or 67 where just ending these wars with these limbo regions, what is Gaza? What is the West Bank? Is it Israel? Is it Jordan? Is it Egypt? I wonder if that set this whole thing up for the kind of conundrum it's become. Do you think about that?
I mean, I think that, again, I think that there was a certain paucity of vision on all sides. But particularly between 1949 and 1967, it's more on the Arab side. And I'm not talking about the whole the whole sort of pro-Israel criticism, like why couldn't they have assimilated these people? It's not necessarily incumbent on other countries to absolutely assimilate every refugee. and it is incumbent upon them to care for them, but not necessarily assimilate them. That could have been a solution if both sides, it's interesting. What's in Lebanon? It's interesting. I understand from Lebanese friends that there are two kinds of Palestinians in Lebanon: the Palestinians who wanted to become Lebanese, who are happy to become Lebanese, and the Palestinians who didn't want to become Lebanese, who wanted to remain Palestinian. That's fine. That kind of trajectory, but even beyond that, even sort of not thinking about whether Egypt might have made all the Gazans Egyptians and Jordan might have made all the Palestinians Jordanians. In the alternative, they could have said at least some kind of semi-autonomous. They could have said set in place the seeds for statehood instead of sort of just keeping this restive population wanting to come back to Israel. So yeah, the limbo in those years was I think the fault of the prevailing Arab authorities, Egypt and Jordan at the time, and the Arab world and the international community. But subsequently, after 1967, Israel becomes responsible for sustaining the limbo as well by allowing settlement, while never annexing, because they didn't want to actually bring the Palestinians. They didn't want to have to make a decision. You either have to enfranchise them and they become citizens, or you make them permanent second-class citizens, which is a kind of it's not apartheid in the classic sense. That's why I object to the terms of apartheid, because it's not something that has that comes from a racial motivation. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Arab Israelis who are full-fledged citizens. But it is effectively apartheid for the people of the West Bank, and that's what it's creeping towards, because of now we're looking at. I know that, for instance, Democrats on the Hill, they perceive this sort of sequence of Trump naming Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, and Mike Huckabee is an absolute annexationist. He thinks that the Judea and Samaria, as he calls it, are all part of Israel, the whole thing. And then Netanyahu naming Yechiel Leiter as ambassador to the United States comes from the right wing, the extreme right wing of the settlement movement, also sees the area. So they see that sequence as portending annexation. And Trump has not counted it out. He's as opposed to 2020, when he thought it was like a bad idea. And in a recent interview, he said, well, I don't really see two states working. We have to work on something else, like a one state, perhaps. So, but what does that mean? Does that mean that the Palestinians in the West Bank become enfranchised? If not, you're left with perpetual, short of ethnic cleansing, which of course raises its own horrific prospects, you're left with perpetual tension and the prospect for continued violence. People who aren't enfranchised are happy.
Yeah.
In an enfranchised context, when you look at your neighbors, that's one of the paradoxes. If you've lived if you've dealt with the Israelis and the Palestinians, is to the degree to which Palestinians over the years, and they'll say it, they'll admit it, they'll say they became like Israelified in terms of their ambitions. They wanted what the Israelis had. They wanted the enfranchisement. They wanted people sitting in a parliament in Jerusalem arguing with each other and determining policy, because they were exposed to a degree, because they were exposed to it. So you can't have, that just shows that you can't have one disenfranchised population living aside from the moral aspect of it, which is also a problem. It's just not viable.
When I contemplate that happening, as wild as it seems, that Trump comes in and they annex, the West Bank, that scares me so much as someone who believes in Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
Because my nightmare with Israel is that in 50 years, the story will be this: left-wing, progressive, socialist, pragmatic Jews founded the state of Israel, far-right messianic Jews basically destroyed it by just being crazy and delusional, and that's my nightmare. And what's so scary is I saw an interview with MK Simcha Rothman, and they were talking about this. And what is so scary is they can't even talk about what their plans are. Like I was saying, like, oh, well, people know the two-state solution. Well, what's the alternative? They don't have a narrative. He literally could not. It was like, well, we'll come up with. I don't know what we're gonna do with the. Will they be able to vote? And
it looked like if you could have your way, what would we be doing?
I think personally, I think Friedman program makes a lot of sense. It basically says apply sovereignty on the land, and then people ask, okay, so what about voting? What about what would you do with the population? And Friedman shows in his book, which is also a beginning of a solution. It's not like two-state solution does not solve anything. So people are saying, okay, so what's your solution if not two-state solution? So I say, because two-state solution worked so wonderful. Now you ask me how my solution will work. But I'm saying what Friedman says and what exists in many other countries in the world, that the fact that, for example, the United States has control and sovereignty over Puerto Rico does not mean that people from Puerto Rico are voting for Senate or in the way the people from New York do.
I don't know if you saw Ambassador David Friedman has this book, One Jewish State.
Yeah.
Where he says it's some bizarre system where it's like the town will vote. It's some Rube Goldberg thing. But he's like, well, they won't all get citizenship immediately, but that's okay because we have Puerto Rico in America, and they can't vote.
Right.
Except but it would be different if Puerto Rico was next to Indiana. You know what I mean? Like,
right. It's not it's not Guam. It's not far out in an ocean. It's actually in the United States. Yeah, I know what you're saying.
They don't know what they're gonna do. They don't know how to explain it. Does this scare you?
Yeah, no, I think it's not so much scares me, but it does say to me that you're right. They don't have a plan. You talk to people about how do you handle the enfranchisement issue, and they say that they'll come up with like, even the more reasonable ones, like you talk to the settlers in Gush Etzion, I think are remarkable in the sense that they really do kind of care for their Palestinian neighbors. I think that they don't like to see them discriminated against or harmed. I mean, I don't know what it's like post October the 7th. This was, my impression pre-October, and they advocate for them. But then when you ask them about so what are you going to do when they want enfranchisement, when they see the things that you're getting because you vote? And they say, well, these are people who don't really understand democracy, or, they just go into these old racist tropes. And it's not like racism. I think it's not racism born out of like the kind of malign impulses that usually inform racism. It's just racism as an excuse, but as an excuse not to have to deal with this. Like, let's think of a reason. Let's come up with a reason why we don't have to let these people have enfranchisement. And it's just, again, whatever, aside beyond, it's not whatever, but beyond the moral considerations of keeping people as second or third class citizens, it's just not practical. It's not going to work. It's that people see the very practical implications of being enfranchised and being deciding what kind of schools they have and who their teachers are and what the curriculum should be and whether the garbage gets picked up once a week or once every 2 weeks, and just basic little stuff like that, and who they get to trade with, who they get to export with. Because I'd imagine under Friedman's view, they'll figure out the garbage and it'll be fine, but then it goes beyond that, because what if, and this is what happened during Oslo, when Israeli and before Oslo as well, when Israeli economic interests, because they had, not out of ideological reasons, but because they had the infrastructure, because they had preeminence, because they had the upper hand, they were able to sort of block Palestinian exports to certain areas because they wanted to, they wanted to sell their strawberries to Europe. They didn't want the Palestinians to sell their strawberries to Europe cheaper, so they made it harder for the Palestinians to get their strawberries to Europe, that kind of thing. And when they see that, they're going to get mad, and they're going to want to say, we need the kind of sovereignty in order we need the kind of sovereignty that enables us to trade freely and to have our own foreign relations. And that is going to feed discontent, and that's going to culminate in violence.
Just to illustrate your point about, I mean, it sounds crazy to even say it. Okay, they're proposing this, but they can't even explain what they're going to do. That sounds crazy. But you were mentioned on the last episode of the great podcast Unholy, which is hosted by Jonathan Friedland and Yoni Levy. And speaking of that podcast, they had on the very influential commentator, journalist Amit Siegel, who's like close to Netanyahu. They had him on. This topic sort of came up of like, what do you do to the West Bank? And his answer was, Jordan's going to probably collapse, and that will solve it because we'll just like move
That'll
them.
become the Palestinian sovereign state. That's the other delusion.
I'll give you two examples. What time can do. One option is, it's not Netanyahu's idea, it's just my thought, that Jordan might collapse. I don't know how long a state controlled by a tiny minority with 70% of a Palestinian population might survive. And then if Jordan collapses and you can reshape the map between the Mediterranean and Iraq, you can find an alternative solution.
Which is like, it's also crazy because really, I mean, is that what you're counting on? Like complete chaos across the Jordan River? It's like with ISIS, on the other side of Jordan in Iraq and other, really, that's the solution that you're waiting for? It's all, beyond it being like passive, like we'll just wait for this failed state to happen and then the Palestinians will be happy to go there and run things. I mean, that doesn't just happen overnight. It's not an easy, viable solution.
So this is the heartbreaking scenario I'm thinking about. As someone who believes Israel has to exist, I think it's super important for the safety of Jews worldwide. I just, it's crass, but I've come to the conclusion it's either Israel or Holocaust.
Right.
It's sort of Israel or 1939. You want to be a helpless minority that just begs people, please help us? Or do you want to have a chance? So it's very important. And so this is the question that haunts me. If Israel annexes the West Bank and whatever they do, but they don't give all of the Arabs that live there the vote. I mean, I know I can't defend it, certainly.
Right.
I don't know what I'm going to say because there's no defending. I mean, whether apartheid is the perfect term, I don't know, but it basically...
It's interesting in terms of not that this is what you're talking about, this scope, but in Americans, well, you are, like you're talking about how does the Jewish diaspora respond. So in 2021, the American Jewish Committee made sort of negative waves because that was, or 2020, sorry. That was when Netanyahu was contemplating annexation and Trump stood in his way and so did the United Arab Emirates. And the American Jewish Committee, one of its top officers, Jason Isaacson, said, obviously we wouldn't like annexation, but we would continue to defend Israel if it annexed. And then more recently, I think one of my colleagues, I think it was Andrew Lapin, actually did a survey of American Jewish organizations. Not a survey, he just did an article asking them questions. And it was much more negative than that. They really questioned as to whether, the degree to which they could support Israel should it annex the West Bank. So there's a lot of, in other words, I think there are a lot of people who are thinking like you exactly. How do you reconcile those two things? Your natural support for Israel as existentially important to the survival of the Jews, and it's taking a step which puts it in the realm of sort of quasi-apartheid, which is very, very difficult to support.
I've always been upfront that the benefit of not being, I have no books on Israel and Palestine. I approach this issue as pretty much an open-minded learner. So, I'm open to the evidence. For instance, when we spoke, and I'm still, my default is 2 states. That's the only practical option. But since we talked right after October 7th, one thing that I do consider a lot more now is the geographical issue. That the West Bank has the high ground, would be
Right.
looking down on the main population area. So I'll just say it openly, like, there's a chance that it just might not be able to work, that you could do it and it would be a disaster. Like,
It's not binary. Solutions aren't binary. I mean, Dalia Schindler, who's a great demographer in Israel, very, very, very bright analyst. She's talks. I mean, she's not the only one, but she's one of the more prominent ones. Talks about a commonwealth. I don't know how you get there because, commonwealths like, let's say, Canada, you have a bunch of actors who are willing to get along. You need to get the Israelis and the Palestinians to that place. So you have like in other words, you have shared sovereignty. It's not a binational state, which I don't think is viable at all, but it's sort of separate states within an entity, and they work on foreign policy and they work on security together, but then they're responsible for themselves. And so that sort of addresses. And again, I don't know how practicable it is. I don't know how you get there. I don't know how you reassure the Israelis that that whatever concessions they'll have to make on security are viable. But you have continued Israeli security presence in the West Bank, which is the high ground. But you also have Palestinian sovereignty, and you have if you have a separate Palestinian entity within this commonwealth, and you have, instead of clashing interests, you have interests that are trying to reconcile. Israel is trying to reconcile. Israel's interest is maintaining, keeping Israel secure, and therefore having some say in what happens in the West Bank. And the Palestinian interest is keeping Palestinians sovereign and free within whatever security structure Israel needs to make it viable. This is something that Kerry had generals working on in 2013, John Kerry, 2013, 2014, trying to come to that kind of accommodation. Yeah, can you get there? Is there you need the kind of mutual trust that doesn't exist right now in order to get there?
But here's what I struggle with. I have a lot of issues with the genocide allegation. Because I've thought about it, and there's a number of different things. I mean, there's just the fact that Raz Siegel alleged genocide, I think it was 6 days after October 7th.
Right.
It was like the next week.
Right.
When the
total...
No,
not just him, but it was happening everywhere.
Yeah,
within days.
When the total dead was 4,000. So, is that serious? That, that seems off. Also, there's a question about whether they're just changing the definition of genocide to brutal war. But and correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong. Here's my definition of genocide. We're going to kill all of the Armenians, just line up women, children, just kill them all. Just wipe them out as fast as we can. We just want to wipe them out. That's sort of right? I mean, that's genocide, right? Basically.
Well, I mean, the whole thing that was made clear, but it was always clear, but was made clear in this particular context with the South African petition to the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice ruling that the Palestinians needed to be protected because they were vulnerable to genocide is the definition of intent. Intent is critical in understanding genocide. I mean, a lot of people can die in a war or in a warlike situation, and they're going to be there will likely be come out of that war crimes and crimes against humanity charges. And I tell people, stop complaining about Israel being charged with war crimes. It's already jailed soldiers pending trials that are for actions that are effectively war crimes, even if they're not being called war crimes within the Israeli context. So that's almost a settled issue that there are war crimes.
Yeah, certainly. I just think if they believed it was genocide, I would see these accounts saying, one, Egypt must open the border immediately because they're all going to die. Right? I mean, imagine if England had a border with Germany during World War II, and for some reason they just closed. All these Jews were there.
Happened with Switzerland. Switzerland did close the border. So yeah.
Like American Jews would have been shouting in newspapers, "Open the border, let them out."
And they did. Yeah. And they did that with Switzerland. That's exactly what happened.
So these people alleging genocide, you never see them saying that. That's one. You never see them saying.
Good point. I hadn't thought of that. That's true.
You never see them saying, "God damn it, Hamas, accept this deal." We know Hamas has rejected a number of deals.
Right.
You know, they would be saying, "Give up these hostages, this baby you're holding. Stop it. They're going to kill all the Palestinians." So that's one side. And so I made that argument. But here's where it gets difficult. Like this Twitter space with the Israelis. And I've spoken to Israelis. And I'm not saying it's the majority. Maybe it is. I don't know. But they are very open. We would really like it if all these Gazans move. They do. I will say this. They're like, I don't want it. This doesn't sound good. I don't want them dead. I just can they just move to England or Egypt? Right. That is, I hear that a lot. And then I see the destruction in Gaza, which is severe. And I'm like, man, I really hope the IDF has those lawyers I hear about. And anyways, are you also conflicted in this way?
Well, I mean, I think that, so the way I sum it up, or I have summed it up in the past, it's not necessarily with people, individuals who speak in social media or in other areas, but if you look at I think there were 3 or 4 quotes that the ICJ extracted from the South African complaint to consider intent, without determining whether there was intention and without determining whether it was genocide, not even having gone to that point. And what disappointed me with the ICJ, I completely expected it from the South Africans. It's a corrupt government and a performative one as well. But I was surprised that the ICJ actually embraced these ideas. So there were 3 definitions, or 2 or 3, in which they took the context. They removed the words from the context. So, for instance, one where Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, was clearly referring to Hamas, and they allowed a decontextualized quote to make it seem as if he was referring to all Palestinians in Gaza, but he was talking about the actual militants that they were fighting. So that, for instance, that. But then there was one that was actually, you could credibly say were calls to genocide, and they came from the Minister for Heritage. But the Minister of Heritage, the joke is, let's say he's like the Pope. He doesn't have, how many battalions does he have? None. In other words, he doesn't make any decisions. He's not the person like Gallant or Netanyahu, when they're quoting Gallant and Netanyahu, who's actually making the decisions of what, the military decisions of what goes on in the Gaza Strip. Or it's like when others have quoted Giora Ireland, who's actually kind of like it's interesting because he's kind of a liberal-leaning general, and I think that they're also misquoting him. They were taking him out of context, but he's also retired. He has nothing to do. He has no decisions to make, and he was talking about, he was talking about a strategy of starving Hamas, and they were extrapolating from that he meant starving the Palestinians, so he wanted to starve them to death. But again, even beyond whatever distortion that they were applying to his words, he's not a decision maker. But the issue with but then, the natural follow-up to that, once you point that out, that the Minister of Heritage, whose name I forget, it's a pretty common name, I don't know why I always forget it, but anyways, is that, okay, he's not a decision maker. He doesn't have any role in the security cabinet, but he's a minister who has some degree of responsibility for education. So why, even though Israel's not committing genocide, that there's no real proof of intent, even though those words have been taken out of context, or they come from people who have no decision making, why is Netanyahu allowing within his cabinet somebody who speaks sometimes in genocidal terms? I think one of the things he said is that Gaza should just be nuked. And then why? And the other broader question is that how does somebody like that come to be in a party that is strong enough to be part of a governing coalition, and he occupies a senior position in that party, senior enough that he gets a cabinet minister? And that's I think that's the dilemma. Israel's not committing genocide. I don't think there's any big credible proof. Genocide is a huge term. And also not necessarily. I don't think that necessarily everybody who uses the word genocide is malign, but I think it originates with a malign intent. It wants to rob the Jews of one of the more, one of the things that a non-Jews
Dave,
the
yeah, David Duke now is like, you see, the Jews, they're guilty of this.
Exactly.
The
That's
real genocide here.
yeah, that's that's exactly what it comes from. But on the other hand, like, what is going on within the Israeli polity that this person can become the minister of heritage? And that's what and those hard questions also need to be asked. And they need to be asked by diaspora Jews of Israel. They need to be asked. There are Israelis who are asking them. There are Israelis who completely he comes. I forget whether he comes from Smotrich's party or from Ben Gvir's party, but there are Israelis who say that it's completely inappropriate that these people, have representation in the Knesset, that these ideas are in any way preeminent. But still, obviously, if they're being elected, if they've got 15 seats in the Knesset, then something's going wrong in that they're allowed to prevail to that extent.
So I want to be more specific for you and the audience. And so I have an example that I brought up on my last show, Swirly Fruchter. He's doing this 1840s series. I don't know if you know it, but he's interviewing 40 Israeli leading thinkers, and they ask the same 18 questions. Very good. They had a previous do you know a guy named Moshe Capel? He's like a mathematician, academic guy.
Nice. I'm vaguely familiar.
Okay. So he was on it.
What do you think should happen with Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after the war?
That's a hard question to answer. Because I'll tell you what we want, all right? What we want is for them to no longer be a threat to us, okay? And the way for them to no longer be a threat to us is for them simply not to be there, okay? As long as they're there, they're going to be, using rebuilding as an opportunity to rebuild the threat, to rebuild the tunnels, to rebuild their weapon stock and their positions, and so forth. Honestly, and hypothetically speaking, and I want to make sure I'm clear on this point. This is hypothetical. If Gaza would sink into the Mediterranean, that would be the actual optimal solution. I don't mean with people in it. Okay, if it simply disappeared, then there would be no threat to us. In other words, the point for us is not, hey, we have designs on Gaza. We would really like to be living there. We want to put all of the Yishuvim back there. There are many people who want to do that, but they mainly want to do it because they think that is the only way for us to maintain military control of the area, that you can't maintain military control without a civilian presence, okay? But that's not in itself important. What's important is that the threat cease to exist over there. One thing that we should be doing, and it's primarily because the United States and Egypt have prevented this from happening. You may have noticed that when Russia invaded Ukraine, right, Ukrainians left Ukraine, Russians left Russia. Many of them came to Israel, right? But with the war in Gaza, right, taking a heavy toll on civilians, why are there no Gazan refugees going to the Ukraine? Okay, maybe the Ukraine wouldn't be my first choice either, but why aren't they going to other countries? Well, nobody's letting them out. Israel would be perfectly happy to let them out, but Egypt isn't letting them out, and the United States has not done anything in order to force Egypt.
Okay, so this, and I've spoken Israelis, I hear it all the time. This is not an uncommon attitude,
Yeah. Well, first of all, the one thing he said, it's just so weird to me. That he said that you can't have military control without a civilian presence, which, I mean, I think he's referring to, the first stages of the building, of expanding the Yishuv, the Jewish presence, where you'd send young military-age people to live and to become couples and to marry and to raise children, but they're also in a position to defend the state, like if they were up in the north, in the Galilee or something. But at post-state, when you have a standing army that's ready to deploy or should be ready to deploy to every corner, that doesn't make sense at all. Civilians in a territory that you want to make sure is quiescent, but you don't actually want to control, you don't want to have in perpetuity, the worst thing to have is civilians there. They kind of get in the way. They're a distraction. I was a soldier in the Gaza Strip in the 1990s. I can tell you that the need to protect the settlements actually reduced the ability to deal with the First Intifada. The purpose of the First Intifada was to keep the nascent Palestinian violence from reaching inside Israel, and the settlements were actually a huge hindrance to that. So that's I don't understand when people say that, and they just say it's accepted doctrine. It doesn't. There is no such doctrine, and it doesn't make sense. But beyond that, the whole thing of Gaza disappearing, everything would be great if something, not great. Everything would be easier if something disappeared. If Mexico disappeared and there was a huge ocean between, between San Diego and El Paso and Guatemala, it would make things much easier for controlling the border. But that's not going to happen, and and doing anything to bring it about to happening would be intensely immoral and disruptive. If you're talking about ethnic cleansing, which never goes well, and so I don't know what these people are, imagining. Why do they think that it's just like Amit Segal saying, well, Jordan's going to collapse and the Palestinians are going to take over? Why do you think that's going to be like an easy, bloodless transition? Why do you think, and even in the most selfish perspective, why do you think it's going to be bloodless for Israel if that happens? Why do you think it's going to be bloodless for Israel if Egypt opens its borders and Palestinians start rushing out? And they're always going to be consequences. And so that's why, it's really, really difficult to deal with a population that has been educated. It's difficult to deal with a population that you don't want to enfranchise, and it's even more difficult to deal with a population that's been educated to reject your existence. But that doesn't mean that the alternatives that the alternative not dealing with them somehow is possible, or even or viable or practicable or moral. You're going to have to, it's like what Rabin said, you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. But it's, and people hate it when you mention that, but it has it's just true.
It's so interesting because growing up as a kid at synagogue, Sunday school, peace process, peace in the Middle East. You'd hear it. You'd hear that word in articles. No one says peace. Like, anybody who says peace in the Middle East, like, is this a joke? Are you joking right now? Like, it's not even said. It's very interesting. But so I talked about how this troubles me. And so what troubles me in particular is when I heard Moshe Capel say that, I saw a few hours after watching this video. It looks like some kind of movie, and it's just, crazy. And if you see the photos of Rafah, it's like a moonscape. I don't know how much of Gaza is just rubble.
I've read 75% of it, but I don't know.
But I played that in combination with Capel because that really troubles me. Because I think about, and I know it's true, like and it's important to not judge Israelis by the standards of an NPR listener in Vermont, okay?
Right.
Because it's very easy to have that attitude in Vermont.
Right.
Okay? Your brother wasn't killed in a stabbing attack. Your cousin isn't a hostage, okay? But when I heard Capel and I saw that destruction, and I know that there are soldiers in the IDF who believe, and because they're literally they went to high school with the kid who got killed on October. Their best friend was killed, tortured, And I hope they did not destroy things. I hope they're not just trying to destroy Gaza in the hopes that it's going to be so miserable they're all going to try to leave. I'm not stating this well, but do you worry about that?
Yeah, I worry about that. I worry about the. I mean, I also see evidence of responsible army officials trying to mitigate against that. You see that in terms of there is a very detailed, and I've heard this from others. I've heard this from people, in the who have been in the upper levels of the U.S. government, people who've been interlocutors for the Israeli defense establishment. But you saw a very detailed report in the Washington Post the other day, and what was remarkable about it was that the headline was that how Israel loosened its rules of engagement after October the 7th. But it was a damning report to the degree that Israel had loosened its rules of engagement. So in terms of collateral damage, I think that in some situations where it used to be one civilian for one terrorist, it went up to 20 civilians for one terrorist. But I think it's also telling that they're still thinking in those terms, that there are, that they are trying to figure out ways to mitigate, even to a lesser extent, to mitigate the destruction and the death of civilians. And so it kind of belies the whole thing of like that there's an institutional effort to try and wipe out the Palestinians, but certainly that there are individuals who think that way, that are carrying that you hear about, not just individual soldiers, but commanders who might behave that way. And that's why there's going to have to be an accountability for people. I'm not saying that the international court system, which in itself is very problematic, is the way forward, but Israel itself is going to have to make accountable the officers who issued the orders that perhaps were informed by a desire to just simply wreak revenge on civilians.
By the way, yeah, great decision, IDF, to let your soldiers post on social media. That's really gonna
right.
That's really wise, and I'm sure you won't regret that over the next 5 years when you're having to evacuate people out of Brazil and France. It's so horrifying. So, like I said, in that Twitter space, I heard Israelis say, they just say, move them out. And they just say this. They want to just deport all of the Gazans. I'm not saying all Israelis, but a fraction. And I had this, it was almost funny, it was so crazy. So there's this guy named Ronan, and he was saying, move them to Jordan. And I said, can I ask you a question? I said, well, what country is going to take them? What Arab country is going to go along with this? And he said, Jordan. And I said, why would Jordan be part of this? He's like, oh, well, you don't have to get their permission. We'll just dump them in Jordan.
Right. That always works. Yeah.
And then, but we literally had an exchange where I was like, why would Jordan take them? And he just yelled. Everybody was yelling at me. He just yelled, because they have to.
Right. Yeah.
Because they have to. And it's like, the delusions and I've heard this a lot. And they really believe this. But what's so scary is they think they can get away with it. And I tell them, like, are you willing to give up an alliance with America for this? And they yelled at me. They said, that won't happen. No, America needs us too.
You talk to Israelis and they think that the Christian evangelicals won't let this happen. They're not, and they don't see the erosion of support for Israel among younger evangelicals. So they don't know about it. They just have this idea, John Hagee is going to stop this or something like that. Yeah.
They really think that they can just deport 2 million Gazans, and that it can happen, and that they literally tell me sometimes, well, they can write about it, but it'll be done. Some people will bitch, but you tell me, am I wrong? Are they right? I mean,
no, they're wrong. Yeah, I don't think Israel's reputation is going to be able to withstand that kind of far-reaching action. It's ridiculous for them to believe it can.
This guy, they all started yelling at me. The moment I said, do you think Israel could get away with this? They just went ballistic. And one guy said, who cares what, he started saying, who cares what Brazil thinks and da-da-da-da thinks. I'm tired of caring about what we got to do, what we got to do. And I said, I'm not talking about what people say. I'm saying, do you really think Turkey's going to allow 1/3 of Israel's oil, which comes from Azerbaijan, to keep coming?
Yeah.
When it deports 2 million Gazans to Jordan somehow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they just they're totally cavalier, and it's a scary common.
Yeah, it's scary because they're just they're running with scissors without realizing that the blades are pointing out, and that there are going to be consequences.
And then on the other hand, well, right where we began, this situation also, it's like, I'm not agreeing with them, but I can understand where their point of view comes from, because this situation is so bizarre.
Yeah.
To have this weird limbo region, it's not part of Egypt, and I see posts from Gazans, and there was one that went viral where the guy's like, yeah, I'm sorry about October 7th. I'm sorry I didn't participate in it.
Yeah.
That it's very well maybe the case that the vast majority of Palestinians really just want to conquer Tel Aviv, that they're not interested in compromise. And so and I understand, like, the Israelis in this space were saying, I have to build a family here.
Right.
And we can't have this crazy situation.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's the missing piece among the Palestinians, and it doesn't help that it is missing among so many supporters of the Palestinians. And well, it's not entirely missing from the Palestinians. Like you say, you hear a lot of, like, there are a lot of Palestinians who will say that October the 7th was a catastrophe, and it was you see that to a degree. The even Palestinian Authority, the Fatah, are saying that it's a catastrophe precisely because of, it was inevitable, but not taking into account the realistic expectations of any kind of people who don't want to live with the risk of 3,000 people crossing their border one day and killing 1,200 people for just being there. It is an existential threat that Israel faces. It's absolutely right, and but again, the solutions are, like you say, they're not simply airlifting 2 million Palestinians to Jordan. That's not what's going to work. It's just going to be hard. They're just, the bringing of the sides together and the recognition of each of the natural rights of each side is just going to be hard work.
It's interesting what somebody in the space said, and they literally said, it was like a poignant quote. They're like, I want to be a normal country.
Right.
I don't want to live with the people who want to kill me right next to it. And it is sort of an impossible situation. My argument to them would be, in 6 years, Israel should try to do one last go at the peace process, because they always say, oh, they don't want a deal, they'll reject anything. If they believe that, then Israel should definitely make a gesture, because it will help Israel in the PR war when they reject the deal. And I don't think Israelis realize it's been 30 years since Camp David. Israel is seen as the bad guy. People don't remember Camp David.
Right. It's been more than 30 years. It's been 40 years since Camp David, yeah.
What are the questions that you are internally grappling over on this subject, or sort of internally debating? What are you worried about?
Well, I think we've talked about some of them, like the fact that not a lot of people seem to have the ability to hold in their minds like two things at once. That on the one hand, Hamas sovereignty in Gaza posed an existential threat to Israel. On the other hand, that addressing it needs thoughtfulness and not simply a wrecking ball. On the one hand, that weaponizing the word genocide against Israel is hugely dangerous and anti-Semitic to a degree. And on the other hand, that Israelis are going to have to cope with the abuses that some of their officials and some of their soldiers committed, which likely amount to war crimes and, in terms of the deliberate denial of food to parts of the Palestinians, even crimes against humanity. So can you hold those things in your head? Can you be like non-tribal and say, no, we have to be in the camp that says Israel's doing nothing wrong, or in the camp that says Israel is the original sin, and actually sort of deal with Israel as a normal country? Because other countries have, 15 years ago, the Americans in Iraq, for instance, how many people are in Russia now and Ukraine? Who's calling for the dismantlement of Russia? What Russia is committing in Ukraine, I think, is more far-reaching and more than anything Israel is doing in Gaza. Has less legitimacy because Ukraine never sent 3,000 of its strongest young men across the border to willy-nilly kill Russians. So but nobody's saying that Russia doesn't have a right to exist. Nobody's saying that the whole Russian entity is somehow a sin that needs to be eradicated. And so if you can keep those conflicting thoughts in your head, that would be, and I don't know to what degree anybody can. Obviously, I'm doing it, you're doing it, because I think a lot about it because I'm a journalist and I have to consider actual solutions rather than wish lists when I'm writing. But I don't know to what degree others are. And what scares me is I think that, I say I'm a journalist and I have to consider actual solutions, what actually is viable as opposed to what somebody wishes. And you'd think that would be true of politicians, but if not politicians, at least politicians who actually ascend to power, who become lawmakers and prime ministers and ministers. But it's not. They're here as well in the States as well as in Israel. You get the wish listers rather than the problem solvers.
I've interviewed a lot of Israelis. I've talked to a lot of Israelis since October 7th. And what I noticed when I was listening back to the interviews is I am much more anxious. That they're very serene. I'll ask them questions. Oh, are you worried about what's going on with the Democrats? And I interviewed Seth Frantzman, and he was very even keel. He's like, well, the left has always had an issue with Israel since the 70s. Most of them will grow up, or blah, blah, blah. But I really do worry about Israel. Not just I've thought about the nightmare scenario of they just get nuked by Iran.
Right.
Yeah. And I began thinking about that scenario because I had this horrible thought popped in my head when I was watching the student encampments of if they got the news that Tel Aviv was nuked by Iran, how would they would, and I have this, and I think it actually would happen. I think they would dance.
Yeah. Some of them would. Yeah.
Yeah, they would play music and they would dance if a second Holocaust happened. Basically, I'm really worried about Israel in my lifetime. Are you that worried, or do you not have any existential worries for Israel?
I'm reading a great book now. Amos Alon, the Israelis' Founders and Sons. He wrote it in 1971, and it goes over the elements that came into making Israel in its beginnings. And it's fascinating, but it's also reassuring in the sense that Israel is here to stay. There's no going back. As of May 14th, 1948, particularly, there was no going back. It became a country. I'm worried, obviously, about how it continues, what happens. I don't think that Israel is going to be dismantled. I don't think that Israel is going to. A lot of people are. I don't think that there's going to be a. I mean, an Iranian nuclear strike. I just don't think.
That's the extreme example. But why are you so sure it's here to stay? Like, for instance, let's say, I don't know, 15 years from now, President AOC or something, and Israel just does stupid far right. They just keep pushing and pushing, and they lose the American alliance. Let's just say. Turkey says we're not giving you oil. I mean,
Israel.
you know.
I mean, only because Israel. I mean, the first 19 years of Israel's existence, it was, or even for the first 19 years, it was far more isolated than it is now. I mean, Israel's allies, when at its founding, its actual functional ally was like whoever was running Czechoslovakia at the time, because they were arming Israel. They weren't getting arms from the United States. They had Truman's diplomatic support, but they didn't have, you had an American government that was actually tracking down people who were getting arms to Israel and seeking to prosecute them. So Israel survived worse than this.
And I hate to even make the comparison because the terrible people make it and it's wrong for so many reasons. But what if it starts to just get the Rhodesia treatment?
Then it's going to be bad, and it would make me very unhappy. But I don't have that existential concern about Israel, but I do I do have concerns about how it's how it weathers that kind of treatment, if it gets the Rhodesia treatment, or if it does the kinds of things that will make people think it merits the Rhodesia treatment. Both things are very concerning.
If I went to you on every Friday since October 7th, and I said, what percentage certainty do you have about, I'm aware of what the IDF is doing in Gaza this week. They dropped 10 bombs in Jabalia because da-da-da. Because for me, it's basically been, I don't know what's going on. Like, what I've been interested by is how useful it would have been if there was an account on Twitter that just would tweet how many bombs had been dropped every week.
I think that, yeah. I mean, you're asking me. I mean, I just because when I retired, I actually put these into archive. But I have the, I have both the IDF channel informing me of the bombs it's dropping on Gaza, and I also have a pro-Palestinian channel for journalists informing me of the effect. So, if you asked me on a Friday, like, what do I know at that moment? If you just called me out of the blue, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I would be able to find it fairly quickly, and I would have and just by seeing the alerts on my phone, I would have a broad idea of what went on. So yeah.
So percentage-wise, like if I said, what has the IDF done this month? What percentage do you think confidently you're understanding?
Of what? What is the...
Of what has been going on in Gaza? Like, I think I know definitely like 30%, or what would that number be?
I would be able, like, by doing a quick check, 100%, I'd be able to find out.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's funny, if you had come to me...
That's the other thing, though. I mean, I was going to add, I would be able to give you 100% of what each side's reporting, and sometimes the reporting actually lines up with obviously they have different spins on what's happening. The IDF says it bombed a facility and killed a terrorist, and it believes that X amount of civilians were killed as collateral damage, whereas the Palestinians say that there were no terrorists there and that it's all civilians who were killed. But I would be able to tell you, that this facility was bombed in any case. The question is, what are we not seeing? What are we not? What are both sides not reporting? We know, not to get too Rumsfeldian, but we know what we know. We don't necessarily, we know what we don't know. There's stuff that we don't know that we don't know.
Stupid little question, but I think it's interesting. How many bombs do you think Israel has dropped this week? Because I have zero awareness. Do you think?
I think it's like it varies from week to week, but this week I'm not sure. I haven't been following so closely. Sometimes I would imagine some weeks it goes up to 200. Some weeks,
200 still?
I think at least I don't know. I would say recently I do remember that being reported, and sometimes it's just like a handful. It depends. It depends on what's going on.
We spoke right after October 7th. Now it's over a year later.
Hmm.
Do you have feelings about? I certainly. Israel made a huge mistake going north to south. They waited 9 months to cut off Rafah.
Right.
What looking back, what mistakes do you think have been made?
I think that Israel should probably been more flexible in November of 2023 in allowing the ceasefire to extend and allowing the release of more hostages. Mistakes from the Israeli side. Hamas has just made mistake after mistake from the beginning. It's maybe not from their perspective, but I think even from their perspective. But if you're asking, I think that I think it was a mistake for Netanyahu not to come immediately clean with what happened on October the 7th in terms of the negligence that led to it, because I think he's lost the confidence of the Israeli people. And he has, I think that he has, it's not just that he's lost the confidence of the Israeli people, but the Israelis have lost confidence in themselves, and that's debilitating. And, you obviously, it's like ripping off a scab, or, ripping off a Band-Aid, or you at first it's going to be really painful to realize that what mistakes were made. But once you have that perspective, it doesn't, it's like always, once you get the facts, it's always easier to get your mind around them, to see what you're how you prevent it from happening again. And and Israelis don't have that assurance yet. They don't have the assurance that their government is ready for the next eventuality. They do have the assurance that the government is able to step up after a catastrophe, because of what's, you have a situation in which Hezbollah and Hamas have been decapitated, and Iran is on the defensive, and that's very well and good for the Israelis. But you still have this underlying concern, like what is going on. And Netanyahu his government is so opaque in terms of how it deals with this, that how can you have confidence that this government will competently handle the next crisis? So I think that is a mistake.
I think he's going to win re-election.
He might. I think that as soon as it's like here, except it happens over 6 weeks in Israel instead of a year and a half. Somebody looks really, really good, Jeb Bush, or I don't know, like other recent, or Howard Dean in 2003. They look really, really good until push comes to shove, and then all their vulnerabilities come out. And Netanyahu has always had vulnerabilities, and that's always, he's managed to get past his vulnerabilities to be reelected, but never in a landslide, always in a squeaker. And now he has more vulnerabilities that his opponents are going to be able to exploit. And he's basically spent a year trying to play down those vulnerabilities. The best thing he could do would be have a commission inquiry. The best thing I think he could do would be to have a commission inquiry and get it behind him, and say, I've learned these lessons. But he's not done that. And so as soon as the 6 weeks of an Israeli election kick in, all the things that make him look strong now, I don't know if they stand up to the scrutiny that the Israeli media and his opponents bring, especially, there's been this coordinated attempt to defame and smear Noam Tibon, the father of the journalist who went down to rescue Netanyahu. And Noam Tibon is already a critic of Netanyahu, so that explains part of it. But I think it's also the Netanyahuites, the Bibyists, are very wary of people coming out of left field. They have a plan of action for dealing with the Yair Lapid, I think they have good reason to fear a Naftali Bennett becoming a viable candidate. They have plans of actions for politicians like that, but they don't. The people who are going to come out of left field and say, we need fresh blood in this country, enough of Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz and Bibi and everybody, they don't have a plan of action for that, and so now they're scrambling. And I think that shows that, I don't think Netanyahu is as confident as one thinks. The fact that there's this all-out effort to smear Noam Tibon.
The most amazing thing after October 7th was listening to people like Gadi Tab, and they literally, this is how they framed it. This is what we get for the left's it's like a total inversion. For the left's dominate, the right has been in power for 20.
Right.
There is no left, yet they blamed it on the left. It was
There's anything that would deflect, but it's I'm going to go to Israel. I'm going to try and get there soon, but just from a distance, talking to family, to friends, a lot of people aren't buying it anymore. There's a real sort of despairing of the right-wing establishment, and by right-wingers. It's like I think that not every right-wingers is, Netanyahu still has his loyalists, but I think that right now he's doing well in the polls because of the recent successes. But you get into an election mode, and the narrative is necessarily going to include October the 7th. It's not just going to include Nasrallah's assassination. It's not just going to include Sinwar's killing. It's going to include October the 7th, and there's just no way that comes out well for Netanyahu.
My other nightmare that I'm having is it seems like Israel is waiting for Trump's inauguration to hit Iran. They wiped out the anti-missile stuff, and they were saying, and it's very weird, they're like, oh, Iran is totally vulnerable. And the strange thing is that after I heard all these reports, they have done nothing. They haven't returned there. Two things. One, I don't see this worry in is Israel that we're going to wake up and it'll be like, oh, China or Russia is transferred. Because currently Iran has no real fighter jets, amazingly.
Right.
They have like something from 1975. That's not going to stay that way forever. Like, it could, tomorrow they could get real jets from China or Russia,
Right.
Maybe. I worry about that happening or them doing a defense pact with one of those countries. And also, and I wonder what you think, if they are waiting for Trump, that might be a mistake, because I don't know if you've seen Tucker Carlson, but for whatever reason, he's done with immigration. All he does is do creepy Jew,
Right.
What
I don't think it's not just Tucker Carlson. I think it's Trump himself. I think it's J.D. Vance. I think that there's a resistance to drawing America into an unwinnable war with Iran. I think that I said it on Twitter at the end of December. Netanyahu or Israel has 27 days to hit Iran, because I think Biden wouldn't oppose it. I don't think Biden would stand in the way. He might even encourage it. But I don't think that Trump wants that kind of open-ended thing happening on his watch. So, you need American permission for airspace, because there are areas in Iraq that are still controlled by America. You probably need American bunker buster bombs to do it, and I don't think those things are going to be forthcoming. So I don't know how Israel does it with Trump, because I don't think Trump wants to do it.
I just want to predict this, so when it happens. The first week Trump gets in, Tucker Carlson's show, you know how he always makes his point? It's going to be this, literally. He's going to have, like, some crazy Nazi on his show or something. He'll have, like, Lawrence Wilkerson. He's going to do it this way, how he always does it. So you're telling me that my children have to die for Israel in Iran?
Yeah, exactly.
Because why? Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that a war with Iran, I think, would just be like a one-day bombing raid.
Right.
But what do you think Israel should do? Do that? Go try to... Oh, I'm sorry. You got to run?
Oh, no, that's somebody else.
I'm so sorry. Yeah. So do you think Israel should strike Iran?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the consequences would be. I do understand why, like after October the 7th, Israel wants to diminish every single potential existential threat to it. And Iran with a nuclear weapon is an existential threat, even though it's not one I don't think is going to eventuate. It's still closer to an existential threat than Iran without a nuclear weapon. So I do understand why Israel would want to get rid of it, but I don't know what the so I wouldn't anticipate what you just mentioned. I mean, it's like, um, does Iran simply sort of cave and say, "Okay, you got the nuclear weapon, we'll leave you alone now," or does that kind of vulnerability precipitate a kind of regime change in Iran? Um, it's impossible to say. It's open ended, and I think anybody who thinks it isn't open ended is being foolish. We saw what certainty brought us in 2003 in the Iraq War. You can take risks, you can assess the probability of those risks. I understand why Israel itself would say the risk is too great not to address, but I don't know if the Americans uh, necessarily would have that risk calculation.
There's no boots on the ground though advocates, right? I mean,
Boots on the ground advocates for Americans to go into Iran.
Yeah, I don't see anybody
No, I don't see that.
Yeah.
I do see that. Yeah, I do. Like let's say that I think there are advocates for, like, let's say America, United States giving Israel air cover, perhaps with that kind of, or rolling ships into the region, rolling battleships into the region, and putting them on preparedness to make sure that there's no retaliation. And that's the kind of, if I'm Tucker Carlson and I'm thinking the way he does, I'm thinking, well, that means American involvement. It means the potential for an Iranian attack on American soil of some kind, which would raise calls for boots on the ground. In other words, like not necessarily boots on the ground now, but the kinds of situations that could lead to boots on the ground. So those are all calculuses. So I wouldn't venture to say whether it's a good idea right now or not.
If Israel, let's just play this out. This thing that people are saying, relocate all, just get the Gazans out. Mm-hmm. Let's say that happened. What actually would let's just say it happened in 5 years, 2030. Let's say Israel did this. They put them all on a bus and they somehow got them to Jordan or something. I mean, it's crazy to even say, but they literally, people are talking this way. How would that play out? I mean, like, it's hard to even, but how would America?
I think that, the misery that the Palestinians were undergoing. I mean, you look how the what the Israelis considered to be a relatively measured response in Gaza played out. It really sort of diminished support for Israel among young people. It accelerated a process of alienating Democrats, which some Israelis consider to be a strategic asset to the support of both parties for Israel. And that's like with a response that, at least if you look at it, I'm not saying it's a good response. I'm not saying it's a successful response. I'm not saying it's a response that doesn't have problems, but it's a response that's within the realm of how countries respond to unprovoked attacks like October 7th was. But if you're talking about absolute ethnic cleansing, and then and then suddenly like millions of people, in past incidences, if you looked at the Turkish-Greek populations exchanges of the 1920s, there weren't crews of TV people and people with phones who could post to YouTube immediately available to go into Greece and to talk to Greeks who had been displaced from Izmir and the miseries that occasioned, and how they were starving now because the Greek government wasn't ready for them. But that will happen if Israel were to drive millions of Palestinians into Egypt, or somehow, I'm not sure how, get them into Jordan or elsewhere. That will happen, and it'll be very bad and isolating. It will accelerate Israel's isolation.
Turkey, I mean, what would Turkey do? It's sort of interesting war game. I think the oil would be shut off. I mean,
I'm not sure. I mean, Turkey. I mean, Erdogan is a fiery rhetorician, and he's very sure of himself, but he also has interests in mind. He has Turkey's economy in mind, and so I'm not.
You don't think he would cut off the Azerbaijan oil in that situation?
I mean, not necessarily. That would be like an act of war. It would be open-ended. He's not insane. So I'm not sure that he would do something that would so alienate. I mean, he's an irritant within NATO, but he wants to be an irritant within NATO. I don't think he wants to be pushed out of the Western alliance.
All right, here's another really easy question. Let's just say we go in a time machine 20 years right now, and they tried the two-state solution. It failed. They attacked Israel. Blah blah blah. And it's proven. There's a poll. It's the greatest poll ever, and it shows definitive. 98% of Palestinians want to kill every Jew in Israel. This is an impossible question. What do you do then?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure. Like, what after 20 years of a two-state solution would have happened that would lead. I think that Palestinians aren't different from other peoples, and I think that if you have 20 years of relative prosperity, and if that works out, you're not going to get a poll where 98% of them want to throw every Jew into the sea. The problem with Oslo is that it, to the degree that it benefited Palestinians, it benefited only the elites, and that was a problem that was the fault of both the Palestinian leadership at the time and Israel. Rabin's famous statement is that they don't have a Supreme Court on the Palestinian side. In other words, they're able to carry out repressive measures against the Palestinians against the people that they would consider troublesome without the checks and balances that Israel had. Israel relied on the Palestinian leadership, on the PLO, to keep the Palestinians in check. If you actually have a two-state solution where there's democratic accountability, I just don't see that happening.
Let's end on your remarkable career. You're retiring from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which is, by the way, for the audience, check out their archive. It's incredible, the reporting that the JTA has done for over 100 years, right? But Ron is a legend in journalism with regard to Israel, Jewish affairs. I mean, few people know it better than Ron, and I've probably met more of the historical actors. Let me frame it this way: do you know who Theo Von is?
No, who's that?
He's a podcaster, comedian guy. But it's one of the biggest podcasts in the world. Trump went on it, Southern accent. I think it's like the fourth biggest podcast. He went on Joe Rogan like a month and a half ago. Mm-hmm. He had a explicit anti-Semitic rant. Just straight up like, it's because the Jewish media is trying to demonize white guys. Yeah, and maybe the Jew, like legit. It wasn't a joke.
It's not true. Well, why? I don't understand why left-leaning media, which is mostly Jewish, are calling people white supremacists, dude.
Jewish? Did you just say that?
Yeah, I just don't understand.
Left-wing media is mostly Jewish?
I mean, according to my Jewish friends, it is, But why do they hate white guys?
Right.
It was not. There is so much going on and so much anti-Semitism. It's so normalized. That has not yet even been reported.
Right.
It's not even been. And I thought about if that had happened 2013, it would have been a scandal. This week, Elon Musk has tweeted out 2 videos of Nazis, Ian Carroll and this guy Ken O'Keefe, who you probably know. This nut, not even reported. And I understand it. There's just so much going on. You're leaving JTA at that moment where something that would have been a scandal of anti-Semitism in 2008 is now so normalized it's not even reported on.
Yeah.
Sorry for the dark framing. I wonder, do you have thoughts on what was the situation for Jews when you began versus now?
I think that the situation, there wasn't as the threat against Jews wasn't as explicit. The taboos against anti-Semitism were stronger, but I think that's just become because of an overall erosion in how we talk to one another in society. I think that the kind of massacre at Pittsburgh was still unimaginable. The hostility that Jews on campuses have faced over the last year was unimaginable. And it's just you're right. I think that when you had but this is happening. This has happened to all legacy organizations, legacy media. So when the attention that's being paid is so much more diffuse, you don't have the same authority figures coming out and saying this is wrong. I mean, Abe Foxman, for instance, was ubiquitous in the 2000s in a way that his successor.
By the way, is he missing?
No, he's around.
I haven't seen him in months. Greenblatt. I mean Greenblatt. Yeah.
Oh, I see Jonathan Greenblatt. I don't know. I mean, but I don't blame him because it's just people don't necessarily go to the ADL but there was like a designer, Parisian designer or an Italian guy based in Paris. I forget his name, but he'd made kind of like Nazi apologetic statements, and Abe Foxman got to him, and the guy apologized and was re-educated, and Mel Gibson, and that kind of thing. Now people saying stuff like that, they sort of sink out of sight because there's so many of them. And so, yeah, that's definitely, you're right. I hadn't heard about this person going on Joe Rogan and making completely anti-Semitic statements, and it just simply seems to have gone under the radar, and that's terrible.
I mean, it's so horrifying. I don't even want to say it because I don't even want to believe it. Do you know some of the top podcasts? I mean, top 10 podcasts in America are Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, this Theo Von guy I mentioned, and even that Holocaust denying guy, Daryl Cooper, Martyr Maid, if you remember that.
Right.
Disgusting guy who said that the Germans killed the Jews because they were so concerned about the Jews suffering, literally. He also has one of the top podcasts. It's like what happened is after October 7th, because there's limited attention that we can spend, we've looked to the Middle East, understandably. So we've just looked away from the domestic, the Nazis marched in Ohio, and it's like, we have enough to deal with. That wasn't really big news. But I think we're going to, once all this stuff in Israel is over, we're going to turn back to this domestic situation. And basically, we're going to find the spider in that room is now 5 feet taller. But I understand it. I haven't been able to look at right-wing anti-Semitism since October 7th. It's just too much. What do you agree?
That the spider is too tall?
that there's just not enough bandwidth, not enough hours in a day for people to, focus on this craziness in the Middle East and also this horrifying rise of anti-Semitism on the right.
No, I think you're right. I think it's also politicized to an extent in that each side is anxious to claim that the other side is overstating the anti-Semitism on its side, and so because of these this New Orleans attack on January the 1st, you've seen people. I mean, I just had Mort Klein of the ZOA who was talking to me yesterday because he wanted to wish me a good retirement, saying, and everybody's always talking about white supremacists. The threat's not from white supremacists, and there's almost an eagerness to downplay it. No, the threat is coming from both sides. Equal attention has to be paid to both sides. And if you, there was a Washington Post story that Trump actually wants to shut down the white supremacist tracking mechanisms in DHS once he assumes power. That's a really bad idea. It's not. It's So yeah, I mean, there is so much happening that you're not seeing, like you say, the giant spider in the room. But it's also, there's almost a willfulness to politicize it that's helping blind people to the presence of the white spider in the room, the giant spider in the room.
On the left, what is so crazy and so clear now, it used to be, I used to say it and it would sound controversial, but now it's obvious. There is so much more energy, activism, organizing to basically destroy Israel than to get Americans universal health care. If you look at DSA, they spend more time banning Zionists than they do fighting for health care. Like, why is that? Is it foreign money? What have you thought about the left reaction to October 7th? Yeah.
Oh, I think it's been, inadequate at best. I mean, there is like I think that one thing that Biden and Harris did right, as far as the Jewish community was concerned, was that whenever they offered criticism of Israel, let's say for, Netanyahu for not getting in humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip fast enough, they would always preface it by saying, October 7th is one of the worst calamities in Jewish history since at least the end of the end of World War II, and that it was horrible, and that, and so obviously Kamala Harris and Biden are the moderate left, the center left, and I think what the left forgot is that you're not going to get Jews listening to you. I mean, or maybe they just didn't care. You're not going to get Israel listening to you if you don't acknowledge that to begin with. If you don't have that in your statement, and why they forgot, I think that for any number of reasons, they sort of an attachment to not an attachment, but like an attraction to radical ideas, the romanticization of the Palestinian resistance, of resistance in general, anti-Semitism. I mean, it's just like there's a whole sort of an array of reasons why.
Do you see Greta Thunberg said she's basically done with climate change? She's just gonna... No, seriously, she's like, I'm just focused on hating Israel. Did you see that?
I didn't see that.
Yeah.
But I think that's a problem with the like, what good is that going to do you? I mean, I did a story over the summer. I was in Australia and I wrote about the this whole doxing incident where like 600 Australian creatives were doxed, Jewish creatives were doxed because they had like a private chat where and they were just venting, and the things that they were saying they were venting about were used against them. But one of the interesting things, I knew this already, is that the reason this whole thing started is because I forget what it was called. There's an esteemed Australian arts publication, Outlander, I think it's called. Anyways, so very soon after October the 7th, it published an article, an appeal, a letter from creatives who weren't not necessarily Jewish, but accusing Israel of apartheid and genocide, and those things offend, and that's what that letter that these creatives wrote is what created, and it ended up creating the WhatsApp channel where all these Jewish creatives were sort of like saying, "Oh my God, this publication is a locus for the non-Jewish space that we occupy as creatives, and yet it's turning against Jews." And the thing that really offended them, I think, they talked about the use of the word genocide and apartheid, but also like calling, I forget how they put it, but basically calling the October the 7th a military act, and not calling it terrorists, not calling it massacres. And so I'd written that, and I thought, did this publication ever respond? So they wrote another open letter, and they said that, please listen to us more carefully. We're Jewish creatives, take us into account, etc. So I wondered, did that publication, the original publication, did they ever respond to the Jewish letter? Because the Jewish letter is what created the WhatsApp group. But I was wondering, and so I looked it up, and yeah, they did respond. And the deputy editor wrote something like, I'm a lot more worried about the death of a child in Gaza than somebody's sensibilities being offended because of a poster they see in Melbourne suburb. And that is like, that goes to what the problem of the left is, in that that letter, that open letter that they wrote was to the Australian arts minister. What's the arts minister going to do to stop what's going on in Gaza, to stop Israel from nothing? Israel's not going to care what the Australian arts minister says. But if you keep yourself from saying something that's really offensive, or if you say something really offensive to Jews, if you call what Hamas did some kind of military action, and that can actually cause harm. So what you're talking about is like, so when the left says, when Greta Thunberg says, I'm going to devote myself to Palestine, what's she going to affect about Palestine? But if she considers more about what she says about things that would affect Jews in Sweden or Jews or wherever she's living now, that can have an effect. And so, that's what I think. I mean, that the left has, in some cases, that part of the left, the pro-Palestinian left, has lost its perspective, and they're just screaming. But things in Gaza are worse. They're screaming, yes, they're worse. They're worse, and there are ways to affect them, to make them better. And not all of them are the ways that you're advocating, by the way, but there are ways to make them better. But meantime, what you have agency to do, your agency matters less in Gaza than it does to the Jewish family down the street. When you're or the Jews on your campus, when you're putting up flags that validate Hamas. As one of the Australians said to me, and she was a leftist writer. She's one of these very sex positive writers. She's written books about sex positivity. That was her sphere, but she was Jewish, and she had lived in Israel for a while, and she'd lived in the South. And she said, these people, it was very difficult for me to continue to interact with people who would be happy, who wouldn't care if I was raped. And that's actually a real reaction. And that, of course, is going to make you much more uncomfortable. And so that's what the left has stopped thinking about.
What is astounding, it enrages me, because I like the other day, I literally had an interaction where this guy was calling Jews Nazis. And literally the end of the exchange, he was like, shut up, Jew. He just like revealed, yeah, I'm an anti-Semite. So we literally have had anti-Semites weaponizing the Holocaust to call Jews Nazis. Does that piss you off as much as?
Yeah. I mean, it's look, the more you diminish, I mean, it's far-reaching. It doesn't just affect the Jews. The more you diminish the Holocaust, the more likely that people are going to recommit its abuses.
Why are people so addicted to this narrative of, and they really love it? They have a saying: "Imagine becoming what you used to hate."
Yeah, because they.
It absolves them, I guess.
Yeah, it absolves them. They don't have to think about it. It's one of the most vexing and horrifying events of our life, my life. No, not my lifetime, but people who are living lifetime, within living memory, has been the Holocaust, and people don't want to have to grapple with it. And also, they just again, it's the removal of taboos, and some of the most seductive taboos, because they're so embedded and because they seem to make so much sense in their context. It has been the diminishment of Jews for any number of reasons, or making Jews responsible for the world's evils. And so, once you remove the Holocaust, you can go back to those easy answers. So I think that's a large part of it.
Yeah. And my stance has always been, there's terrible suffering in Gaza. If you are very critical of Israel and think this war has been way too harsh, totally respect that. But if you just depict it as Israel is just, I literally saw today, they say Israeli snipers targeting toddlers, and you never mention the hostages of the situation. I saw Jeremy Scahill of the formerly of the Intercept, when Israel bombed Assad's old chemical weapons, he called it terror bombing. I mean, it's just crazy. I was thinking, just so we could touch on this, if I could just quickly name figures that you've met, and you could just give me your take on them. Okay. Rabin.
Oh, he was a socially awkward person who wasn't necessarily a visionary, but became a visionary because of what he experienced, what he saw. I think, he supposedly, his opponents sometimes, his political opponents would mention the nervous collapse he had during the 6-Day War, but I think that actually speaks well of him because he recovered and he won the 6-Day War. He was chief of staff, but also because it showed how aware he was of Israel's vulnerabilities. And Israel, there are assassins who kill people, and they're always changing something. They're making the world a less safe place. But I think one of the most consequential assassinations historically, two of the most, are Martin Luther King and Rabin. Those assassinations, malign, bad people, actually changed history for the worst.
Did you ever meet Mayor Kahana?
Yeah, no, I was in the same room as him when I was an 18-year-old. I was living in Israel, and there are all these signs around Jerusalem: "Come here, Kahana, speak." He makes sense. Don't believe what other people say about him. That kind of thing. And I went with a friend, and I just remember, like, there were other people, young people I knew who that had the desired effect on them. They would. And I'm not congratulating myself, but he sounded just as stupid in person as he did, like, as he was depicted in the newspapers. He was bloviating. He was delusional, and I just walked away saying, "How could anybody believe anything that this person is saying?" It was like he had the headquarters of Kach at the time were on a Sishkin Street, which is one of the nicer thoroughfares in Jerusalem. It was in a room, and it wasn't in a big room. And I just remember, like, all these, seeing some people being transfixed by him and not being impressed at all.
Anybody who's impressed by him should look at the book he wrote in the 60s, which is so embarrassing. He wrote, like, the Jewish case for the Vietnam War.
Right.
So embarrassing. Ehud Barak.
Ehud Barak also, somebody who was, I don't know how he saw himself in history, but he was, I think, a little too invested in the idea that he was, like, Israel's savior. It's what led him to actually destroy the Labor Party effectively by taking, I think, 11 people and moving over to the Netanyahu government, whichever government that he joined. And his personality, his sort of, one of the things, like, what's about the Camp David meetings in 2000, there's this myth arisen that Israel's offer didn't go far enough. But I spoke to the Palestinian negotiators at the time, and they thought that Israel's offer went plenty far enough, that they needed to work out details, and that, I think it was a failure of will of Yasser Arafat after that to actually step up to the plate. Barak was ready to go to the plate, and he had I think Barak did have the courage of his convictions at the time, because he was ready to sell to Israel, to the Israelis, what would have been a very unpopular plan. And he was, willing to stand behind it. But what's also true is, and I think when people say, "Oh, no, it was Barak," what they're extrapolating is from reports that during the talks that Barak was kind of arrogant and dismissive of Arafat, which I fully believe, because he has that sort of very self-assured, superior personality. And so I think that might have gotten in the way of, partly in the way of the Camp David Accords, of a new set of Camp David Accords in 2000 or 2001. But primarily the failure of those accords was Arafat.
If you could have made any Israeli politician you ever met or knew of PM, who would it have been?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, that's a hard one to say. I think that, there was a woman, Yuli Tamir, was an education minister in, I think it was Barak's government. Let me look it up. But she was very interesting and imaginative in how she approached education, both for Israelis and Palestinians. Yeah, I think she was education minister in the Ehud Olmert government, 2006, 2009. So, she would have been more interesting if she'd gone. I don't know if she would have been prime minister, but she was like a a very earthy intellectual, which is, seems like a contradiction in terms, but shouldn't be. And so it's too bad that now she seems to be doing okay. She's going from her Wikipedia thing. She's an academic now, but it's too bad her political career didn't extend.
Worst Israeli politician you've ever seen?
Oh my God, there are so many.
Moshe Feiglin.
Oh, Moshe Feiglin, yeah, he's pretty bad. But also there are people who are associated with Shas who are just terrible, but also just terrible at being politicians. Weren't persuasive, didn't try and persuade anybody. So yeah, there are a bunch of them.
Do you think the Haredi are going to get away with what they're trying to get away with, which is we're not going to work, we're not going to serve in the army, you're going to pay us?
I think, you're talking about, will they get away with it? They've been getting away with it since Ben Gurion. So
well, they keep getting away with it.
The question is whether that's sustainable. And I think it's becoming less and less sustainable because Israel is in an actual extended war, which, the dimensions of which it never actually entertained. Even the devastating Yom Kippur War of 1973 didn't last anywhere near this long. I think it was done in 3 months, more or less. And then there's just tremendous calling up of reserves. There are people who are leaving the country because they can't take it. And everybody says, well, how are you going to train the Haredim? You don't have to train them that much to take up the kind of rear positions, rear work like cooking, just logistics, whatever, to free up other better trained soldiers to move to the front and to relieve people who are constantly and therefore to share the burden more equally. So and I don't know if that's sustainable anymore. I think that is uniting people more than anything else.
Who's the best advocate for Israel in the world? My nomination is Haviv Rediger.
Oh yeah, I think he's great. I agree with your nomination.
Oh, okay. Alan Dershowitz.
Yeah, he is shrill. I think he makes mistakes. He says things that are just not true sometimes. And he's become so partisan, with his closeness to Trump that he has, and not just his closeness to Trump, the kinds of cases he's taken defending Jeffrey Epstein, and not ever sort of, he doesn't have to be accountable for it. I mean, a lawyer has to do the best job he can, but never saying that, never saying that the consequences of Epstein's release were deleterious, never acknowledging that. Who needs that? Literally, I mean, I don't want to mention her name, but like one of the most prominent pro-Israel and centrist pro-Israel, like not like a lefty or anything. Like as soon as the Epstein stuff started coming out a few years ago, she wrote a post on Facebook saying, we should never let Alan Dershowitz near pro-Israel again. He's tainted by his association with this man. And she's right. I mean, you don't want this guy going on TV and defending Israel because of his associations. And the associations have the legitimacy of any association of a lawyer doing a good job on behalf of his client, and great. But Jeffrey Epstein turned out to be a really, really, really terrible man, and Alan Dershowitz is a person who defended him. So why would you want him in a pro-Israel space?
Do you have any insight on what did you hear about Epstein? Like what the source of his money? I mean, there's so much crazy speculation.
I think he was like he's a very charming person who really convinced people that he could he could make a lot of money for them, and he was that he had a lot of innovative ideas. I don't know. In other words, I don't know anything more than anybody.
Okay. Les Wexner gave him the largest residence in New York City for $1.
Yeah, I know.
Let's just talk about Judaism for a second, and because it's so easy to get caught up in anti-Semitism stuff. I don't know how religious you are, but what is the most interesting part of Judaism?
I think that there's so much, right? The whole concept, for instance, of not necessarily having to believe in God in order to be able to be an Orthodox Jew. That is, the practice is more important than the belief, which is so alien to religions. I think that I think it was Maimonidean concept that, of charity, that the highest form of charity is where you don't know who receives it, and the person who receives it doesn't know who gives it. The charity should be an act of giving in itself. It should not be a matter of being honored. That's great. That really sort of, not that it's, a lot of these things are unfortunately followed in the breach. Which you see, like, if you ever go to Columbus, Ohio, and see Les Wexner's name on every single building. But that's great. There's a lot of cool things about Judaism. I mean, we can just
A favorite Jewish text?
Amos, the book of Amos, I guess. It's a good one. It's poetic. I mean, I think I read it when I was young, and I just loved the poetry of it. I don't know if I read it today, I would agree with the sentiments, because it's pretty extreme, but it's a good book too.
In closing, you have such a unique perspective. What have you learned about Israelis? I mean, we know the classic thing, the Sabra, that they're sort of rude, or they're direct in a charming way. What have you learned about Israel? What have you learned about American Jews over the course of your career?
Well, I think, it's sort of it's unfortunate, because it's not like a revelation. It's just like something I agreed with when I first read it, and it's controversial, but everything I've lived through has validated it, which is that, Aleph Bet Yehoshua, the great Israeli novelist and theorist, said once, which is that basically diaspora is a form of neurosis. It's very difficult to reconcile being a Jew within the context of another nation, and Israel resolves that for you. I mean, you really stop thinking about, it's the one place in the world where you stop thinking about being Jewish. I mean, you can stop thinking about being Jewish anywhere in the world, but then you assimilate and your Jewishness disappears. But if you want to keep your Jewishness up, you have to work at it full time. And working at something full time, that's an idea of belonging, it's an idea of faith, it's an idea of culture, is you're constantly thinking about it, you're working through it, and it's a form of neurosis. In Israel, you can stop thinking about being Jewish entirely, and you'll still be Jewish. The rhythms of the country, the language of the country, the fact that the country comes to a stop at 4 p.m. on a Friday, is still, all those things are Jewish, and you're adjusting yourself to them, and you're not even thinking to yourself necessarily, oh wow, I'm doing this because I'm Jewish. And I think that is, that's the blessing of being an Israeli. They don't have to think about it, an Israeli Jew. They often do. They argue about it. They pass laws. They have crazy debates in the Knesset. They're not immune from the neurosis of the diaspora, but they have the option of opting out of it and remaining Jewish. But it's if you want to remain Jewish in the diaspora, you don't have that option.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.